everybody. We're so glad to see you all. And I'm hoping you're glad to be here. How many think it's a good lunch so far? Oh, good. I see a lot of hands. Well, welcome. Hello, Andy. How you doing? Good. Jim Robinson here? Yeah. That's okay. Folks, I want to say welcome. We have a great program for you today. And so what I'd like to do is call this meeting to order so we can proceed. One of the things we're going to do right now is give our announcements. So as you see, our featured presenter today is SDG&E, our corporate sponsor. And we want to say thank you to SDG&E for the presentation we are doing today on the path to net zero. Let's give a hand. And so our sponsor for today is Climate Tech, and you'll be hearing from them in just a moment. But we'd like to make an announcement about what is happening the rest of September and October so that you know, because I don't want you to miss out on anything. I have FOMO if you do. So that's fear of missing out for those who are older than me. That's okay. Anyway, we want to welcome our new members, and we'll have membership up in just a moment to welcome everyone personally. But we have at the end of September this thing called World Workplace. Now, how many are new to IFMA? Oh, good. Oh, there are a few. There is a place in Nashville that is holding a conference for the International Facility Management Association. And that place is going to give all kinds of education and networking opportunities for associate members and for professional members. So that is happening the last week of September. It is in Nashville. If you haven't signed up, you'll be paying a big price, but it's worth it. And good news for anyone who's going. All right, for those who are going, if you have not received the announcement in your email, there is a thing called a West Coast reception happening the Thursday night of World Workplace. And that West Coast reception is an $85 ticket. Wow, but we got great dinners, prizes, everything. But for San Diego chapter members who are attending World Workplace, the chapter has covered your ticket. So you can go for free and enjoy all the networking you want with every single chapter in the entire Western United States. And that's all the way out to Hawaii, all the way up to Washington, Oregon, all the way down to San Diego. And the reason I bring that up is because we have some sponsorship opportunity for that West Coast reception. The good news is that you don't have to be there, but your logo will be there to sponsor. And every single chapter from San Diego all the way up to Washington, Oregon, all the way over to Hawaii, and guess what? Canada's been invited, New York's been invited. So if you'd like getting your name out there, this is an opportunity for you. Please see Brian Shute. Where is Brian? Have a stand. Please see him. You can pledge as little as $250 up to $1,000, and we will make sure that every single person attending will see your logo. And we'll know that you're from this chapter here and that you have opportunities for them. Does that sound great? Yeah, I thought so. Okay, so next we have, in October, we have an expo. This expo, we are also joining with other associations like BOMA. I know there's a few members who are dual members, triple members, all of that. BOMA, IREN, SDG&E, and IFMA all get together with their associate members, and they will display for everyone to walk through. If you are like me and FM, I have a shopping list when I go to an expo. I need results. I need to find something, and I go to every single booth and I talk to them because I never know when I need something else. So what a great opportunity for those who are in the shopping market right now for a new vendor or for something. So go to this expo in October 5th at the Del Mar Fairgrounds in Paddock and meet a lot of new people. So that is October 5th. The time I think is, Glenda, what is the time? 3 till what? Till we're done? Till 6. I guess they'll be done with us at 6. So that's a great opportunity. Our annual holiday fundraiser, and we are benefiting San Diego Youth Services. How many know what that is, San Diego Youth Services? These are the kids who don't have a home, who've been separated from their families because of arguments or whatever. They find these kids, they get them back in school, and they try to reconcile them to their families if possible. if not possible, they help them train for jobs so that they can support themselves. So we support them. So right here, the annual holiday fundraiser will be in Wednesday, December 14th at the Valley High. And we are now accepting donations to help the San Diego Youth Center and help those kids out there. Who knows, an opportunity that you give to one of those kids might be a future employee for you. It might be an outstanding employee for you. So think about it. We are accepting donations. Who's collecting those? Is that Linda? If Linda will stand up, please see her if you would like to do that. And I don't see Courtney yet. So then we also have a CFM prep workshop. How many have our CFM? That's a certified facility manager. That is an education, that is something else. And associate members are able to take that too. If you want to know how FM thinks, which is a scary thing, but if you want to know how they think, these credentials are available to you to take the information, to learn about it, to get your credential. And I've had some members who have gone from an associate to a professional because of all that they learned. So there's opportunities for you everywhere. The CFM prep workshop, if you're looking to be a CFM, is Wednesday, November 2nd at the Mission Federal Credit Union corporate office. With that, that's everything we got going on up to the end of the year. We do have other things happening. This is within economywide. Please read economywide to remember there's so many fantastic educational opportunities. So with all of that, I think I should be done with the announcements because most of you guys should be done with food by now, right? Right? Okay. So next, what I'd like to do is bring up Gary Griffin, our new membership chair, as he announces new members, and thank you all for coming.
There we go. Hi everybody, I'm Gary. I'm Business Development Manager for Blue Sky Restoration. Part of the chair of the membership committee this year. Want to just welcome all the new members that we have here. If you guys don't mind just standing up and introducing yourselves. We have Michael Pansel. See in the house today. We got Jono Cherambolo. We got Ken Connors. Okay. So certainly, how about if you're here, would you like to before I go through this whole list? Anybody? Certainly. We do have a couple of the newer members actually as well. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Linda.
Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Legerton. I'm an A1 All-American Roofing in San Diego. I've been here for 26 years. Everyone, look forward to being involved.
Roberto is here as well. If you want to stand up and introduce yourself from Commercial Cleaning Systems.
My name is Roberto Gonzalez. I'm with CCS Facility Services. Business Development Manager there. Nice to meet everyone.
Any questions about membership, then you could always feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to get right back to you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
everyone.
everyone.
I'm Michael. I'm a CFM here in San Diego and getting back into coming to the meetings. And I also brought with me an individual that I'm mentoring. Francis, want to say that as well?
Hello, everyone. I'm Francis. I'm here as a guest on behalf of Mike, and I'm currently in school at Facility Management at UCSD. Completed my second quarter, so I want to thank Mike for inviting me here. I'm looking forward to getting to know people, and I have a QR code there if you'd be so inclined to leave your information, and it's a raffle to win a Starbucks gift card. So if you want to leave your email and phone number, I'd be happy to know more. So thank you for having me.
Here for the first time. Hopefully we'll be seeing you guys again in the future.
Thanks, Gary.
Okay, next we have Our sponsorship chair, which is Brian Shue, he's going to introduce our today's sponsor, our spotlight sponsor.
All righty, well, today's a unique day because we have 2 annual sponsors. First of all is our corporate sponsor, SDG&E. We have Tori and John from SDG&E. They have a table over there, so there's some good information, and we're looking forward to their presentation today. And then Climate Tech, platinum sponsor with us, Brendan.
Does a little bit of everything, right, Brendan?
I do a lot. Yeah, I just wanted to go through a quick overview of Climate Tech. Some of you may know Climate Tech's history. We are a direct competitor with Johnson Controls and Siemens Controls. I won't go through everything here. I just wanted to go through some big numbers and where we're touching. As you can see, we're going across the bottom side of the United States, up in New York also. We started in Phoenix. I think my timeline is coming up. We started in Phoenix in 1975. Bosch was a big improvement for us. They acquired us in 2015, and now our BMS sales, which is building management system, are 2021 right there. So nice thing about Climate Tech is we take small business and large business and kind of combine them both into one. We're direct to owner. There's no corporate atmosphere that we have to deal with, so we can handle any customer as quickly as possible. What do we do? Well, we're in the building automation, controlling your heating, air conditioning. We also have the security side and fire alarm side, and then we also have a energy service that can do audits and make improvements for your buildings. These are just simple little brands that we use and utilize. Definitely all leading technology, and we try to put the best in the building and take care of the customer. We definitely specialize in the areas between everything except for industrial and federal, but we're slowly getting into those fields also. And that's about it. This is kind of showing our portfolio of the big guys that we've been taking care of across the United States.
Thank you, Brendan.
By all means, pick up whatever swag you guys want, unless I have to take home or.
Thank you.
And if anyone else would like to sponsor with this month, please see Brian. He'll tell you all about the benefits, including golf. So next we have Denise. Denise is the chair of our professional development committee, and she will introduce our speaker today. And thank you, SDG, for speaking to us today.
Hi, everyone. Our speaker is Tori Jorgensen from San Diego Gas and Electric, and he will be speaking on the path to net zero, a decarbonization roadmap for California. Please welcome Tori.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here today. So as you mentioned, my name is Tori Jorgensen. I work in the strategic planning group at SDG&E. And just for background on what our team does, is we are responsible for publishing the internal strategic plan, which influences the direction of our company and should achieve some of the goals of the executive set. We also do a lot of market and industry research. And then most recently, we put together this economy-wide emission study that's called SDG&E's Path to Net Zero, and what we internally call the Decarb Roadmap. And before I get into it, there's definitely time for Q&A at the end of this presentation, but if questions arise during the course of the presentation, please feel free to ask and I'll try to address them as they come up. Sorry, I'm probably gonna slip it up here. So just to provide an overview of the decarbonization study, I have no expectations that you guys read this beforehand, but effectively what's happening is California is setting some very aggressive emissions and decarbonization goals, whether you're looking at it from a legislative perspective, some of the regulatory proceedings that are going on, or some general state mandates. And so in order to help address this, San Diego Gas and Electric wanted to complete an economy-wide emission study that really was seeking to analyze and identify a decarbonization roadmap that the state could utilize, as well as something that would apply to our own service area. And we'll kind of go into the key findings and details later on in the presentation, but at the highest level, one of the big findings that we came to was that successful and effective decarbonization economy-wide usually involves the mix or combination of three main elements: clean electricity, clean fuels, clean fuels, and then the last leg of the stool here would be carbon removal. And so what does that look like in practice? So on the right-hand side of this slide, what you're seeing here are the roadmap results for the California GHG or greenhouse gas reductions over time. And what's happening is clean electricity and clean fuels are bringing down the economy-wide emissions, but you'll see that in 2045, we still have about 68 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent remaining in the economy. And those are typically the harder to decarbonize industries like industry, as well as like medium duty and heavy duty transportation. And that's where the last leg of the stool comes into play, as shown in orange, and that's carbon removal offsetting the 68 million metric tons of remaining emissions. And that's where you get to the net zero, otherwise known or called carbon neutrality. I should mention that our study also reached and achieved the major California emissions goals. The two primary ones are 2030, which is a 40% reduction in emissions, and then the 2045 goal, which was recently codified, or I think it might be on the governor's desk, for 2045 carbon neutrality. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay. So having reviewed some of the major key takeaways, let's go through other key findings as well as the overall considerations and structure of our analysis. So starting with the first part, we really learned and tried to emphasize in our white paper that electricity needs to be both clean and reliable. And you'll hear me talk about this later on in the presentation as well. But our study was the first to incorporate the industry standard of reliability, and that provided some really good new insights about generation capacity needs in the future. And it also showed us that renewable energy resources are expected to grow along with it. Going to the second section here, clean fuels. These will play a major role in the future of our decarbonized economy. And I would think about this as playing a role in two different capacities. First would be providing clean, dispatchable electric generation resources. And then the second would be providing clean fuels for hard to decarbonize sectors, like I mentioned earlier, like medium duty, heavy duty transportation, and then also certain industrial processes. Lastly, a key consideration going forward will definitely be affordability, just as importantly, equity. And one of the things that we really stressed in our study was, in order for successful decarbonization to occur, everybody needs to be able to participate and everybody needs to be able to benefit. All right, so let's start going through the different economic sectors. So starting with the electric sector, something to note is that this particular sector contributes about 14% of the total statewide emissions, and is already well on its way to delivering electricity from 100% zero carbon resources by 2045. And that's pursuant to legislation that's out there called SB 100% Bill 100. I'll also note that the electric sector has decarbonized the most of any economic sector in California. It's reduced its emissions by 42%, and quite frankly, none of the other sectors come close. One of the things that I wanted to point out here, and I feel like the slide does a good job of showing it, is that the electric sector helps to enable the decarbonization of other sectors. And it will be an integral component going forward. So said another way, as we start cleaning up emissions in the electric sector, you have a positive impact on transportation, buildings, and the industrial sectors. All right, so what does that mean for consumption and demand of electricity? So I just mentioned that as you clean up the electric sector, you start flowing that through the other sectors. And the assumption here is that there's more electrification going on in transportation, buildings, and industry. And so what our roadmap ended up projecting was that both electric consumption and demand are supposed to increase exponentially by 2045, both at the California and the SDG&E level. And realizing this is just at the SDG&E level, I thought it'd be easier to talk through this specifically. So looking on the left-hand side of your screen, it's showing electricity consumption. And so you can see here, we're expecting it to roughly double by 2045. The primary driver here is transportation electrification. More specifically, an increase in EV charging, as well as the production of hydrogen for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. On the right-hand side of your screen, we have the increase in net peak demand, and it still is expected to increase significantly, just not quite double, 85%. And the primary driver here are buildings. Although I will caveat, transportation and buildings, despite one being the primary driver for one versus the other, are both impacting consumption demand fairly significantly. So the logical next question is, okay, you projected an increase in electric consumption and demand. Well, how are we going to serve that? And the answer would be thoughtfully constructing an electric supply portfolio. And what I mean by that just goes back to what I was talking about earlier is our roadmap incorporated this robust reliability standard. And just to drill down into that a little bit more, we specifically use something that's called the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, definition of a 1 in 10 loss of load expectation. And realizing that's a mouthful, all that means is that while we were doing the modeling to create the electric portfolio with the different resources like solar, natural gas, and all that, it was a very iterative process. And by using this reliability standard, we had to set this constraint to build this portfolio. And the 1 in 10 just means that the constraint or threshold we established was that we were not allowed to exceed a 1-day outage in a 10-year period. And this is especially relevant considering everyone that's within the general San Diego and California area, what we all went through just last week in September 6th, and we all have the text messages on our phone, and we narrowly avoided rolling blackouts. That is a reliability issue. And this is why we implemented this into our model. And so, looking at the portfolio, I think there's no surprise here. You look at something like the yellow portion of the screen here, looking at California, the generation capacity, and there's a ton of solar. And what we really found was that an effective, successful, reliable electric sector portfolio really hinges on renewable energy, energy storage, and then clean dispatchable generation like hydrogen. Now, another follow-on question that we commonly get asked is, well, that's great, you projected these build-out needs, but are we going to be able to do that? And I will say this is extremely aggressive. And to help put this in context, solar is one of the most quickly rising capacity needs here. What this implies is roughly 8 gigawatts of solar being installed per year. And just for some context there, California has historically installed about 1 gigawatt per year. And so we're really going to need to ramp up the pace of electric generation resources, not just renewables, if we want to be able to decarbonize in the future. All right, so moving on to the transportation sector. Transportation is actually the largest emitting sector in California. It comprises roughly 41% of the total state's emissions. And so it's really no surprise here that we're really projecting a monumental shift is needed to electric vehicles, but frankly, more broadly, zero emission vehicles if you start counting hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And what I would say here is that the electrification of transportation It's not just something that we're projecting here, it's very in line with current state policy. Some of you may have seen the headlines recently that, the California Air Resources Board approved something called the Advanced Clean Cars 2 ruling that they were working on. And really all that did was it codified into law what Governor Newsom essentially said as a target via an executive order almost 2 years ago. And that called for, at least one of the more relevant data points, is 100% sales of light duty passenger cars and vehicles to be zero emission vehicles by 2035. And so this is completely aligned with that, and that's actually an assumption that we baked into these following results. So it's reflected in what you're seeing on the screen. Yeah, go for it.
For this transportation section, do they incorporate any type of idea to lessen the number of cars, actually, whether they're electric or not, and increasing and improving infrastructure for cycling, e-bikes, things like that? Because I know it's happening around San Diego and other parts of Washington and Oregon that have fantastic cycling infrastructure. And it's being done here in San Diego. Is that part of this transportation improvement plan?
No, so that's a great question. I will say that in terms of reducing the vehicle stock out there over time, that was not an assumption we made. We more or less were assuming Californians love their cars. That continues to be the case. And we forecasted that out. Now, what changed was the share and the penetration of ZEVs with zero emission vehicles versus ICEs or gasoline vehicles. But it's a great point, and it's something that our strategy team in particular is increasingly seeing as both at the city level, like City of San Diego, and then also at the county level. We're seeing these local jurisdictions starting to establish these goals and aspirations within their climate action plans with their CAS. And so we've seen things like, hey, we want to do X more miles of bike lanes, we want to put more roundabouts in, we want to, increase ridership on buses. But that was sort of outside the scope of this. And we were trying to take a more conservative approach versus taking things off of it. But it's a great point. So, just pivoting back to the California zero emission vehicles adoption. So the graph in the top upper hand, left portion of your screen, obviously we're projecting these massive increases in ZEVs. But to help, frame this a little bit more, the 2020 number, which you can effectively think of as current, that roughly translates to about a 2% ZEV penetration. And then when you start hitting 2045, the 32 million, that's an implied like 85% ZEV penetration. So if that helps you conceptualize the share of ZEVs, I wanted to put that factor. In terms of the SDG&E service area specifically, we're going from less than 100,000 ZEVs today to closer to 3.4 million in 2045. And that's an implied 17 compound annual growth rate, 17%, which is massive. So one of the things that our team wanted to look at too was, hey, it's great that when you do your demand side modeling, you essentially spit out the vehicle stock, right? And the proportional shares between gasoline and EVs. But then the question became, well, at least within our service territory, how many chargers would you need to support that? And so we did a rough estimate, and we're estimating about 640,000 chargers are needed to support those ZEVs up there, specifically the EVs. And that's going up from about 7,000 today. And not to have a shameless plug, but from an SDG utility perspective, what that really means is, as a utility, we really need to start building out the infrastructure now so that the chargers can hook up to the grid and then power these cars in the future. All right, so let's move on to the building sector. And I figured this would be the most relevant slide for this audience. The building sector, when you think about the residential and commercial component together, comprise about 14% of statewide emissions today. And that's just direct emissions, mostly contributed by the consumption of natural gas via space and water heat. Candidly, I've seen research out there when you start incorporating indirect emissions. So I'm talking about GWP's global warming potentials from refrigerants And then also the proportional share of electricity emissions, because it's not 100% clean today, right? It's actually closer to a quarter, 25%. So, obviously, one of the big things we can do to help decarbonize buildings is to electrify building and use appliances, otherwise known as fuel switching. Another alternative is substituting natural gas with clean fuels. And so that would include blends of natural gas with renewable natural gas, as well as hydrogen. And similar to what I talked about on the transportation side, the electrification and decarbonization of buildings is very much in line with existing state policy and mandates. What I would say is that from a Title 24 perspective, if you guys are familiar with that, there's essentially these codes and standards that are updated every 2 to 3 years for new buildings. And most recently in 2022, they were revised for both residential and commercial, but I'll focus more on the commercial side. And they're very much pushing inclusivity of heat pumps. And there is a mandate in several climate zones for installing solar plus battery storage. And so that's just the new building side of things. On the existing building side of things, we have something like the City of San Diego CAP, the Climate Action Plan. And I believe in 2035, they've set an aspirational goal of, I think it's 90% of existing buildings need to be, off of natural gas, which is crazy. I mean, it's super aggressive, but it's a good thing to see in the step towards building electrification. Whether or not that's achievable, I will, leave that up to them. But so you see the momentum that's building for building electrification. And one thing I forgot to mention on Title 24, local jurisdictions also have the ability to essentially propose goals that are actually incrementally more aggressive than the state level Title 24 rules. And those are called local reach codes. And so those are the headlines that you guys are probably seeing in the news about, City of Encinitas is establishing certain all electric building requirements and things like that. So with all of that context, hopefully that was helpful. Let's look at some of the results from our study specifically. So the top part of the slide, right here in the blue portion, is focused on electrified water heating, the share of that, or as I call it, the penetration percentages. And so you can see in 2045 for residential and commercial, we're hitting 95% plus, which is massive. Now, what I will say is that's inclusive of both heat pumps, but also electric, solar, solar electric water heaters. On the space heating side, electric resistance. Pivoting to the space heating, we're also projecting dramatic increases, not quite as much as water heating, but that's really just a result of the estimated useful lives assumptions that we made. And again, that's just a complex way of saying that when we did the modeling, we weren't assuming residential and commercial buildings were just going out to the market without a need and purchasing new pieces of equipment. It was, hey, this equipment has reached the end of useful life. Our assumption was it was no longer, working, and then you would go out. It's called normal works. So, anyways, those are the results of our study. What I will caveat all of this with is, our roadmap did recognize that there are barriers to electrifying buildings. And one of the factoids that we use internally is within San Diego County, more than 50% of the homes were built prior to 1980. And so why is that relevant? It's relevant because older homes tend to need additional upgrades in order to incorporate electrified appliances. That could take a shape or form of electric panel upgrades, but frankly, I got into my house, which was older, and it wasn't even an upgrade, it's just my electric panel was a fire hazard, right? And so those are the kinds of investments you would need to even think before you get these electric appliances. And it potentially becomes an equity issue because, lower income residents tend to live in older homes. And so that's a consideration you really need to be cognizant of going out into the future.
question on that. Are there currently any programs, like either on the desk of the state representatives or anything else, to start to get programs in place to help lower income residents?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm probably missing some here, but just from my research, what I've seen is there was state money from the state fund allocated to low income building electrification projects. I think it was to the tune of like 900 million this last go around. There was some recent legislation that was being proposed, but I don't know how some of that panned out. What I will say is that SDG&E, we did some of these different, heat pump installation, electrification of building projects. I know the funding sort of dried up. If that's the nature of these programs, like they have a allotted amount, and then once it's done, it's done. My understanding is there actually is a current one that just started up. I think it's specific to water heaters, and I think it's specific to residential. However, the good news is I think there is some additional funding in the recently approved Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA bill that we all saw that was passed in the US Congress. And there are incentives and rebates, at least on the residential side, for different heat pump technologies, as well as energy efficiency investments. So, I'm thinking insulation and things like that. However, I don't know the applications for commercial, but if you start looking more broadly at like energy storage, solar, the investment tax credits were just extended as part of this IRA bill. So if you're lumping those in as helping to facilitate electrification, that's something I would definitely be keeping an eye on in 2023. Like most of these big, huge things of legislation, I think there's going to need to be some time to start working on actual details. Quite frankly, I was looking this up just the other day, and I don't even know how one would even apply for some of these rebates quite yet, just because the legislation was passed. And my understanding is that the Department of Energy is actually going to be relying on the state agencies. So I'm assuming in this case, it might be the California Energy Commission to actually facilitate these rebates and incentives. So I think they need to establish the guidelines and the handouts first, but hopefully that will.
Yeah, and then in terms of pushing it forward, I mean, if people did want to try and help, would it be contracting representatives or the California board? I mean, who are the best people to try to reach out to try to keep things moving?
Yeah, I think there would be multiple venues. Politicians is definitely a good one. There are multiple proceedings going on at the California Public Utilities Commission, who's a primary regulator at SDG&E. There are also building electrification related proceedings going on at the CEC, the California Energy Commission. And those are just the ones that come to mind. There are big proceedings going on with the California Air Resources Board. And even though they're not directly influencing building electrification policies, they're doing it tangentially via like scoping plans and things like that. And I think that's part of the complication here. It's like, what venue would you go to? But I think it's still positive in that there's multiple agencies that are looking at this. And having looked at this, just fairly briefly, I think that, it's good that our study put out this information, but building electrification in general, there needs to be more data starting to get compiled around this. And so I'm hopeful in the coming years that we'll have some more of that data. All right, so clean fuels. So clean fuels, in particular, clean hydrogen, are expected to play a major role in the future. And this chart on the left actually is great because it shows that from our roadmap, we actually expect 6.5 million metric tons of clean hydrogen to be consumed in 2045, with the lion's share going to electric generation. And realizing if you're like me, what does that number even mean? To help put that in context, the entire United States national production of hydrogen today is around 10 million metric tons. And so we're saying that one state, California, is going to need more than half of that in the future. And it's going to need to be clean because the hydrogen being produced today is not carbon free. In terms of the gas pipeline system throughput, we're projecting a pretty significant decline, around 65%. But more importantly than that, the remaining gas that's flowing through the pipeline in 2045 is increasingly becoming cleaner. And by that, I mean, we're projecting about a 28% blend rate of renewable natural gas, which is natural gas that you get from methane emissions from landfills or agricultural, processes with cows, quite frankly. And then 14% clean hydrogen blends. All right, so up until this point, I've mostly been reviewing the demand and supply side results with you guys, which I actually didn't have as big a role participating in that. I was mostly on the financial aspect. And so what our team did was we took all the results from those demand and supply side work streams that determine how much electricity we think is going to be needed in the future, how we're going to need that, what we talked about. And then we took all those inputs and outputs and we performed a very high level annual household energy spend analysis to try to gauge the financial impacts for a residential customer on their ongoing energy expenses. And so that would include electric utility bills, gas utility bills, and transportation related gasoline costs. In terms of approach, we developed and analyzed two different types of customers. An adopter is someone that more or less follows the pace or electrifies their appliances and vehicles at the average pace of our roadmap. And then a non-adopter makes no changes to their electricity and gas consumption, and then also owns ICEs or gasoline vehicles. And one example I like to say for the non-adopter is that can include a rental, right? You have no control over the appliances that are going in or out of your unit, and you decide to keep your gas used. So in terms of the key findings, we got some really good insights on the affordability and equity front. So starting with affordability, as you can see here, we found that an adopter actually is expected to pay the same amount in 2045 as they do in 2022. And that's primarily being driven by the favorable economics of transportation electrification. And I won't get into it too much, but if you guys are thinking, well, did you use those crazy gas prices that we looked at, we were all seeing a month or two ago? No, this happened before that, but the way that electricity works and some of the time of use periods and gasoline prices in general, the economics are very favorable. And so what you can see happening in a nutshell is electricity and natural gas bills are still expected to go up by the green and blue portions respectively. However, they are offset by the cost savings from gasoline and transportation shown in gray.
Did you do all that chart in $2022 or is that?
Correct. So that's a great point. They are in real dollars. They're in 2021 dollars, and so they exclude inflation. So if we did include inflation, these would be higher. What we were doing, and the advice we got was especially what we've all been seeing with inflation rates is they've been somewhat unpredictable, and so we wanted to strip that out of the analysis and see if you're just looking at real dollars, what would the impact be? But great question. From an equity perspective, what we saw is that a non-adopter is expected to pay relatively more in 2045 versus their adopter counterpart. And this was an interesting finding, but what is important to note here is that a non-adopter, a customer's categorization as a non-adopter is not necessarily by choice. And some of our low-income customers are the least likely candidates to be able to adopt and electrify due to financial constraints and other feasibility challenges that go along with that, like we described earlier. And so going forward, we really need to ensure that everyone is able to adopt and everyone is able to electrify in order to avoid proportionally potentially disproportionate financial impacts.
Question for you.
Yeah.
Can you explain why the natural gas would be that much higher 20 years from now?
Yeah.
Proportionally, so is it obviously the costs would probably increase?
Yeah.
But is that consumption or is that cost?
No, so it's bills. It's bills. And so you bring up a really good point, and it's definitely worth drilling into this. So what's happening is, if we go back to the prior slide here, what you're seeing here is a drastic decline in gas throughput. And if you think about electricity and gas rates in general, if you were to simplify it, it's really just a fraction with dollars that we need to collect over consumption, right? In this case, gas is 30. And so what happens is when your consumption goes down and you still need to collect the same amount of dollars, your rate goes up. And so what's happening is consumption actually does decrease for natural gas for an adopter because they're electrified, right? But just for context, the gas rate goes from about $2.06 per third today to about $7.60 in the future. And that's a combination of that consumption, dynamic that I was talking about, but it's also a little bit because you start to blend cleaner fuels into the pipeline, like RNG and hydrogen, to try to clean up the emissions from the actual pipeline itself. But this brings up an actual, excellent point about, well, how do we address the gas pipeline system in the future? That's something that we're definitely talking about internally. Oh, and actually, before I move on, because the real $2021 is an important point. Other things that I wanted to note here is we try to take a conservative approach in that we didn't change the way that rates are structured now from an electric and gas perspective. And what I mean by that is that we didn't throw like a fixed charge in there, or anything like that. We use existing rate dynamics and we use that in our analysis into the future. And then an important note here too is because we're a utility, we really just wanted to focus in on the ongoing energy costs, but this does not include the cost for the actual purchase of the or appliances. So that would be an upfront cost. All right, so one of the things we did in our roadmap was we took all of these different findings from our analyses and we made certain proposals. And there's no doubt that California is a global sustainability leader and has made great strides in recent years. But looking out to 2045, our roadmap really shows that more collaboration is needed between policymakers, regulators, and stakeholders across the state. And so what we did is we put together some of these proposals, and they really can be boiled down to 4 main categories here. So first is maintaining affordability and enhancing equity. One of the big things within that bucket is really advocating for rate reform. As electricity becomes cleaner, rates shouldn't necessarily incentivize conservation. They should potentially incentivize electrification to a certain extent, right? Reliance on renewables, things like that. We also need to make sure we support low-income households so they can benefit from the clean energy transition. Second, we need to prioritize electric system reliability. Again, not to rehash it, but reliability is coming up more and more as we go through these heat waves and climate change. And so we need to make sure we incorporate that topic into longer-term state planning. And then we potentially need to revisit our definition of a clean energy technology. And it may need to have certain attributes like being able to be dispatchable. Third, we need to enable deployment of decarbonization infrastructure. So what this is getting at is kind of taking us back to the consumption and demand increases that we talked about earlier on. Well, as a utility, we need to make sure we're building infrastructure to help support that. And so we need to be able to deploy those assets and invest at a similar pace in order to do that. And so there needs to be regulatory policy changes, such as removing obstacles to siting and permitting, and potentially simplifying and accelerating regulatory rules. And then fourth, we need to incentivize innovation and adaptability. That's really around encouraging R&D efforts such as pilot projects, demo projects, and that will help ensure that some of these emerging technologies, some of them are pretty nascent. We need to ensure that they're ready and available to be deployed in the future. And with that, that actually concludes my presentation. Before we get into the Q&A here, I should note, I can definitely try to, answer any other questions, you guys have. These materials, as well as the complete roadmap that we published, the report, as well as our technical appendix, are available online at sdg&e.com/net0. So not, again, another shameless plug, but it's there if you guys want to take that. And with that, I can open it up to Q&A.
so earlier you showed the generation requirements going forward like 20 years.
Yeah.
And solar is, 4 times, it would have to be 4 times generation of what it is today, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So what are in the plans for SDG&E, state of California, to roll out huge solar farms? Because likely it's going to be, you'd have to solarize probably 1/4 of the state or something to
Yeah.
make that happen.
Yeah, so we, in the scope of our analysis, we did not look at land constraints, but what you brought up is extremely relevant. One thing that I will say is like SDG&E, we are not really in the generation business. We're mostly an infrastructure business. And so we're building the transmission and distribution lines to help facilitate that. And it's kind of an interesting time being in the regulated utility environment right now because the state, I think, is trying to decide who's going to be the provider of last resort. And so are we going to, look at generation, reassess the types of assets that, we have? That's a question to the future. But what you're talking about in terms of the land needed on the solar side is absolutely a consideration the state needs to think about. We had some rule of thumb, and I don't want to say because I think it's probably wrong, if I'm not remembering correctly, but I think it's like maybe, I think it's a gigawatt. A gigawatt has like 7,000 square miles or something like that. So it's a crazy large amount, and it's not just solar. It's also onshore wind. They actually have to have an area around it to build some of these turbines. So it's definitely consideration for the state.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna build a little bit on the solar there, in the essence of, I have solar at my house, for instance.
Yeah.
And when, I guess we wholesale our electric back to SDG&E, yet we buy it back at retail. Now, what if, and I don't know if this is even done, but if I were to have a self-supporting battery at home, kept my electric, and yet sold it back to SDG, is that going back wholesale? Or do people do this?
So I'm not as familiar with that just because I'm not, that seems like maybe our customer program team might know a little bit more about that. And we have a net energy metering team that I think deals with things like that, but I'm not as familiar with the solar plus battery pack dynamic. And I don't, I would think that whatever you're doing in terms of when you're expelling the energy from your battery pack, I would assume it would reflect whatever like time of use rate is applicable for that period. But I'm not totally sure. And also what kind of complicates this is some of the different regulatory and legislative proceedings going on about what really should be the rate that residential consumers are paid for behind the meter assets like that. And if there are certain rate components that are not necessarily being collected from solar customers and maybe cross-subsidized by non-solar customers. And so I'm not exactly sure how that dynamic impacts your question.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I mean, we have these text messages coming in that don't use your energy or try to conserve your energy from 4 to 9. Yet you have people coming home off of work, kids coming home from school to do homework, computers are operating, mom's got to make dinner, plus she's got to do laundry. Or whoever. And then, all of the businesses should be conserving energy because they're not there. So help me understand where we're missing that part of it, just to finish.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're describing is what we like to call, it's called a duck curve. And so it kind of looks like a duck if there's like a belly and then a head, but without getting too much into it. Essentially what's happening is we're asking everyone to conserve from the peak time period from 4 to 9 because demand does increase rapidly because like you said, everyone's getting home from work. Yes, businesses may be powering down for the day, but I think we all know that there's still some lights that remain on. There's certain assets or pieces of equipment in the facility that aren't necessarily turned off when it hits 5 o'clock, right? What's happening is the renewable generation resources like solar are ramping down around that time too. So not only do you have an increase in demand, you start having a shortage of supply. And so that's why we ask people to conserve around that time period.
So then you are saying that solar does impact what you have.
So yes, and so part of what we're saying here too, is that's why you need to pair renewable sources with energy storage. Now, what you were asking was more or less on the behind the meter scale, we're talking like utility scale battery storage. So much larger. Go for it.
At the very beginning of the presentation, you talked a little bit about the remaining, in 2045, the remaining 68 million, whatever, that couldn't be converted because of industry.
Yeah.
And there's an offset related to that.
Yeah.
What is that offset?
Yeah, great question. I probably should have covered it. So when we talk about carbon removal, let me go back to the slide so you guys can see it. Oh, there we go. So there are different types of carbon removal technologies out there, but the one that we specifically assume to offset this 68 million metric tons is something called direct air capture. And for those of you that aren't familiar with direct air capture, they essentially look like these giant stackable fans, but they function like a vacuum cleaner, and they suck in air, and they essentially pull the emissions from it.
Okay, so you're going to basically technology for industry to remove carbon.
Yeah, and I definitely.
I guess within the facility, within the production. Again.
Yeah, so the beauty of direct air capture units is they can be co-located with emissions producing facilities, but they could also be in the middle of nowhere. And they just suck emissions from the ambient air. Obviously, there would be higher concentrations co-located of emissions, and so they'd probably be more effective. One other clarification I'll make is I know that I did focus on medium duty, heavy duty transportation, as well as the industrial sector in terms of hard to abate sectors, and that's true. But you'll see that these are the sector breakouts here, and so there's a little bit of emissions coming from agriculture here as well, in terms of the remaining emissions in that 68.
Are those bans current, or is that something close to the future?
So I will say that you don't see very many of them today, and I couldn't even tell you. I think that there's probably a couple within the United States. The one that I'm familiar with, I believe, is located in Iceland, and so we were looking at some of the economics on that as well. And so it's a great question because we need to make sure that those are deployable, at scale in the future, and that's why part of what we're advocating for is encouraging R&D.
Nuclear, I haven't seen anything about nuclear, but if you follow it, there's a lot of interesting technology coming along that.
Yeah,
wild card.
it's been a wild ride, I'll tell you that, because when we first started doing this study, there's a new technology out there that is called SMR, which is small modular nuclear, SMR, small modular nuclear reactors. And when we started this, because this almost took the better part of the year for us to put together, we more or less were thinking about nuclear, especially given some of the decommissioning of certain facilities, that it was more or less untenable. Now, in recent times, in the past legislative session with what went on with Diablo Canyon and the extending the in-service date, I would say that we should probably, if we were to revise this in the future, there probably should be some nuclear, at least to reflect like the present day dynamics, right? Because we did assume the original retirement date of Diablo Canyon, which is in PG&E service territory in our original analysis. So it's a good point.
You mentioned that it takes, said something like 7,000 square miles for, was it kilowatt or gigawatt?
I think it's a gigawatt.
Okay. Is it possible that like grid modernization can bring that number down? Or in other words, is it possible to reduce the amount of land it takes to do that? Or is that something that's feasible for the next 20 years?
Yes, it's a good question. It could be feasible, but what happens is, this is sort of the complexities of the modeling. It's something that, I kind of got to respect for is it's not just the mechanical thresholds of these different resources, it's also the economics. And so we know that solar is extremely cheap wind is extremely cheap. And so what may happen is when you start trading out some of those assets for different assets, just to get rid of those land constraints, you may potentially see an uptake in the price of electricity. And so that was the beauty of what we try to do on the supply side, is we try to come up with an optimized to all of those into consideration. And I'll try to look up, I might have that fact in my notes somewhere. Awesome. I think it's not a question. Go ahead.
You mentioned in the very beginning that electrification is so much well ahead of other industries, other sectors.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well,
What are the challenges that other sectors are facing, or are you
Yeah.
facing?
I would say regulation and legislation. We're a very, the energy sector in general is extremely highly regulated. And, I briefly mentioned Senate Bill 100. Senate Bill 100 is a piece of legislation that passed a while ago. I can't remember how long ago, but that requires that by 2045, electricity provided, and I think there's some nuanced language about retail sales, needs to be from zero carbon resources by 2045, and there are interim steps. So it's not like we can't just do nothing, we're gonna do nothing until 2045 and just ramp it up and procure a bunch of solar and wind in the last year. There are interim steps to reach that. I think that's a big part of it. I think some of the different dynamics that have gone on, nuclear was brought up. We use nuclear, at the time, some time ago. That does not have very much emissions associated with it. I know we think about nuclear as radioactive waste and all that, but it doesn't actually have too many emissions. It's almost emissions free. So I would say the answer to your question is
Is the energy sector advocating for those regulations, or?
I would say, especially what I've seen, just having participated in some of the regulatory proceedings, I would say it's a mixture of everyone. Every proceeding we're in, we have a ton of interveners that represent different public advocacy teams and groups. Of course, we advocate as utility for what we think is best. Then ultimately, it's up to the commissioners in terms of how they rule. But I think SDG wanted to make our energy cleaner, reduce emissions. But of course, you have these rules in place that help that along this process.
It's my understanding that utility companies right now are generating a lot of profits and making a lot of money. I'm just curious if you guys are doing anything specifically like nonprofit wise, or actually like taking the hit to give back to actually make a difference in changing.
Yeah. So, what's been really cool is our strategy team, we get to work with different teams across the company, and we have a standalone sustainability group. And we actually published a sustainability plan that I would encourage anyone who's interested to go check it out. It's actually the second year that we've done it, and it's separate from our parent company, separate, who has their own corporate social responsibility report. But no, that team really deals with how can we get back to the community, whether it's going out and putting out events where we're planting trees, whether we're advocating for certain programs on behalf of our customers. So we definitely do that. Addressing your thing about profits, generally speaking, our utility is a regulated industry. And so what happens is that means, hey, you're not allowed to just go do whatever you want. You need to seek approval. And part of that is we have authorized rates. And so that is what the commission approves for. Again, there is a robust intervener process that goes on in order to get those approved. And so, those are more or less authorized. Any other questions? Go for it.
Sorry, I'm a bit different to this, but what are the plans for improving or maintaining the current infrastructure as we work toward the scared?
No, so as part of our analysis, this roadmap specifically, one of the things that we did try to look at is the need to upgrade like certain residential transformers. If people are starting to adopt more electric vehicles, that's going to be a ton of additional load on our our system. It's almost equivalent to one house. And so what we needed to do is we looked at, hey, how many transformers roughly will we need to, replace and upgrade? And so we looked at some infrastructure types like that. But I would say what SDG&E is doing is way beyond this analysis, especially as it relates to wildfire mitigation. We are constantly looking at high wildfire threat districts and seeing what are ways that we can potentially mitigate risk. Is it by deploying covered conductor lines? We've even come up with certain technologies that if we have these smart technologies deployed on poles, it'll measure the voltage, and if the line snaps, it automatically shuts it off. And so we're trying to do innovative things like that to ensure that our existing infrastructure is good to go and is upgraded if needed, in addition to deploying new infrastructure. And I actually just found the solar stat. I think I was pretty close, but here it is. It's 1 gigawatt of utility scale solar PV requires approximately 7,000 acres. And that's from a study that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tori. We really appreciate it. It's right here, SDGE.com, right on the front page. Your path's net zero. You can watch it right there. You said it was there. I had to check it out.